The courtroom was packed. The air was thick, not with the pursuit of justice, but with the thrill of spectacle. At the center of it all stood Jaden Cole, a 16-year-old black teenager, his frame thin beneath a wrinkled, oversized button-down shirt. He stood motionless, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the scuffed wooden floor beneath his feet. To the crowd, he looked like just another lost kid, detached, confused, maybe even slow. A voice sliced through the murmur, sharp, mocking. "Look at him, a hacker, a criminal, and now a mute." The words came from Judge Hamilton, his lips curled in amusement, his gavel resting lazily in his palm. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if trying to see through Jaden, to confirm his assumptions. "Do you even understand where you are, boy?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom, low chuckles from the jury box, smug whispers from the prosecution's table. "He looks autistic. Maybe he doesn't even understand what's happening." Typical, always trying to play the victim. Jaden remained silent, still. For a moment, the room swallowed him whole. Just another kid, too quiet, too strange, too out of place to matter. And then he lifted his head, not slowly, not hesitantly, but with the kind of deliberate motion that made the air in the room shift. His dark eyes, once overlooked, locked onto Judge Hamilton's, sharp and unblinking. For the first time that day, silence spread like wildfire. The judge's smirk wavered, the whispers died, the prosecutor stiffened. A cold stillness hung in the air, as if the entire courtroom had just stepped onto thin ice. And then Jaden spoke. His voice was calm, unshaken, but his words, they hit like a hammer. "Your Honor, if you're done mocking me, can I correct the mistake in your ruling before you send an innocent man to prison?" The courtroom stood still. A second passed, then another. Judge Hamilton's fingers tightened over the edge of his bench. Someone coughed. A juror shifted in their seat. The power in the room had shifted. And everyone knew it. Jaden Cole was never a criminal. He had never stolen, never fought, never even broken a school rule. But when people looked at him, they didn't see a quiet, intelligent kid with a passion for technology. They saw a black teenager who didn't talk much. And to them, that was enough. Enough to be suspicious. Enough to be different. Enough to be a problem. Ever since he was little, Jaden had been different. He didn't enjoy small talk, didn't care for sports, didn't laugh at jokes he didn't find funny. While the other kids played basketball after school, Jaden sat alone in the library, hunched over an outdated laptop, lost in lines of code. Technology made sense. People didn't. But the world had no patience for people it didn't understand. Weird kid, barely talks. Maybe he's autistic. The whispers followed him everywhere, through hallways and classrooms, even at home when neighbors talked in hushed voices. Jaden wasn't autistic, but no one ever asked. It was easier to slap a label on him than to try to understand him. And now, here in this cold, unforgiving courtroom, they were doing it again. The only person who had ever truly understood Jaden was his mother, Lisa Cole. She had no college degree, no stable career, no safety net. Just calloused hands and a heart that refused to break. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices during the day and waiting tables at night, just to keep a roof over their heads, just to buy Jaden an old second-hand laptop, just to make sure he had a future. But the world didn't see any of that. When Jaden was arrested, the headlines were merciless. Teenage hacker arrested. Single mother raises a cyber criminal. Broken homes, broken kids. Is this the future of America? They didn't see her coming home exhausted at 2 a.m., still managing to check Jaden's homework. They didn't see the way she cried the first time Jaden showed her a program he built from scratch, his eyes alight with something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Lisa wasn't a failure. She was a fighter, and she would fight for her son until her last breath. But how do you fight a system that has already decided to destroy him? For over 20 years, Judge Richard Hamilton had sat behind the bench, deciding fates with a flick of his gavel. He had watched countless black and brown faces stand before him, wide-eyed, desperate, begging for a mercy he never intended to give. To him, they weren't people. They were statistics. White kids, they were troubled youth who needed a second chance. Black kids, they were criminals, and it was his job to put them away before they became a bigger problem. Judge Hamilton didn't fear being wrong, because in his world, he never was. He had sent hundreds to prison without a second thought. No one had ever challenged him. And now, as he stared down at Jaden Cole, he knew this case would be no different. Another boy, another guilty verdict, another number on his record. He was sure of it until Jaden spoke. Jaden never had a chance. From the moment the police stormed into his home in the middle of the night, dragging him away in handcuffs while his mother screamed, his fate had already been decided. They didn't care that he had never broken the law. They didn't care that he was trying to prove someone else's innocence. They didn't care that he was just a kid who saw a flaw in the system and tried to fix it. All they saw was a black boy who was too smart for his own good, and that made him dangerous. But they forgot one thing. Jaden wasn't the kind of kid who bowed his head. He had spent his entire life being misunderstood, ignored, dismissed. He had been labeled, judged, and pushed aside. And that was exactly why he wasn't afraid of them. Because when you've spent your whole life being overlooked, you learn something. People only see what they want to see. And that's why they would never see him coming. It started like any other night. Jaden Cole sat hunched over his laptop in the dim glow of his bedroom. The small space barely fit his bed, and a worn-out desk cluttered with circuit boards, loose wires, and a half-empty coffee cup his mother had forgotten to take away. The steady hum of his old desktop fan mixed with the quiet tapping of his fingers on the keyboard. This was his world: cold numbers, complex algorithms, and endless lines of code. But tonight, something felt off. Jaden wasn't looking for trouble. He never was. He had built a simple algorithm, a script designed to scan public court records and analyze inconsistencies in legal cases. It was just a side project, something to challenge his mind. He called it Blind Justice, a program meant to find flaws in the system that humans overlooked. At first, he ran a few test cases, watching as the program filtered through thousands of pages of legal documents. Most cases followed a predictable pattern: police reports, evidence logs, witness testimonies, everything neatly aligned. But then, something didn't add up. A blinking red flag appeared on his screen. Case number 21-07039. State of Georgia v. Marcus Carter. Jaden frowned and clicked on it. Marcus Carter, 43 years old, arrested 6 months ago for armed robbery at a Wells Fargo branch in downtown Atlanta. According to the prosecution, security footage showed Carter entering the bank at 9:42 a.m. wearing a black hoodie and carrying a duffel bag. The teller identified him. The police found his fingerprints on the counter. The jury took less than 3 hours to find him guilty. It seemed airtight, except it wasn't. Jaden's eyes darted between the timestamp on the footage and another line buried in the court records: a parking ticket issued to Carter across town at 9:47 a.m. That wasn't possible. He ran the numbers again, double-checked the time zones, the court logs, the evidence files. Something wasn't right. And then he saw it. A subtle inconsistency in the video metadata, the kind that wouldn't be noticeable unless you knew what to look for. The footage had been tampered with. Jaden's pulse quickened. Someone had deliberately manipulated the timestamp on the surveillance video to place Carter at the scene of the crime, which meant one thing: Marcus Carter was innocent, but someone wanted him in prison anyway. Jaden stared at the screen, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. He had seen mistakes in court records before: typos, missing pages, even misfiled evidence. But this wasn't a mistake. Someone had deliberately altered the timestamp on the security footage. The question was, who? And more importantly, why? Jaden exhaled slowly, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He wasn't stupid. If he pursued this, he'd be walking a razor's edge. But Marcus Carter was sitting in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit, and Jaden couldn't let that go. His fingers moved before his brain could talk him out of it. A few keystrokes, a deep breath, and he was inside. The Georgia State Judicial Database wasn't exactly unbreakable, not if you knew what you were doing. And Jaden did. His program slipped past the firewall like a ghost, bypassing security logs, leaving no trace. He wasn't stealing anything. He wasn't breaking into bank accounts or selling private information. He was just looking. The case file for State of Georgia v. Marcus Carter sat neatly in the system, just like it had in the public records. But now, Jaden had access to everything. And that's when he found it. The raw, uncompressed security footage from the Wells Fargo robbery was stored in an evidence file. Or at least, what was supposed to be the raw footage. Jaden ran a quick checksum analysis. The numbers didn't match. He played the video. A man in a black hoodie walked into the bank at 9:42 a.m. carrying a duffel bag. But something was off. Jaden rewound, slowed it down, paused. The shadows, they didn't line up. The light through the bank windows didn't match the natural position of the sun at that hour. Someone had overlaid a different timestamp onto the footage to frame Carter for the crime. Jaden's heart pounded. This wasn't just an error. This was fraud. Someone had deliberately altered evidence to send an innocent man to prison. And whoever did it, they had enough power to make sure no one questioned it. But now, Jaden knew. The real question was, what was he going to do about it? Jaden barely had time to process what he had found. His mind was still racing, running through possibilities, searching for the next step. Should he go to the police? A lawyer? Would anyone even believe him? But before he could decide, the decision was made for him. It started with a distant hum, the low, steady growl of an approaching engine outside his window. Then, the flicker of red and blue lights bouncing off the walls of his small bedroom. Then, the pounding. Boom, boom, boom. "Open up, Atlanta PD." Jaden's breath caught. He froze, fingers still resting on his laptop's keyboard. No. This isn't happening. The door crashed open before his mother could even reach it. Boots stormed in. Shadows filled the hallway. Lisa Cole barely had time to scream before an officer shoved past her, heading straight for Jaden's room. A second later, he was on the ground. "Don't move!" A knee pressed into his back. A pair of rough hands yanked his arms behind him. Cold metal snapped around his wrists. "You're under arrest!" Jaden barely heard the words. His face was pressed against the carpet, his heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. He could hear his mother screaming, begging, fighting, but the officers held her back. "Please, he's just a kid. What is this about?" But they didn't answer, because it didn't matter. To them, Jaden wasn't a 16-year-old who had stumbled onto the truth. He wasn't a bright mind with a future. He was a black kid with a computer. And that was enough. They pulled him up roughly, shoving him toward the door. He barely caught a glimpse of his mother's tear-streaked face before they dragged him into the night. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters had already gathered. Someone had tipped them off. The headlines came fast. Teenage hacker caught in national security breach. Single mother raises a cyber criminal. How did she miss the signs? Did this black teen try to hack the justice system? News anchors spoke in grave tones. Authorities say the suspect, 16-year-old Jaden Cole, illegally accessed classified government records, compromising sensitive legal data. Sources suggest he may have been working with underground hacker groups to manipulate court cases. His mother, Lisa Cole, has refused to comment, though neighbors describe her as struggling to keep her son in check. What was he really after? And more importantly, who else was involved? In less than 24 hours, Jaden was no longer a kid. He was a threat, a criminal, a national security risk. And the truth? It didn't matter anymore. The cold, gray walls of his jail cell had been his world for 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the police stormed his home. 3 weeks since the media painted him as a dangerous hacker. 3 weeks since his life became one unrelenting nightmare. And now, Jaden Cole stood here, inside a courtroom that was never built for him. Not as a witness, not as an expert, but as the accused. Judge Richard Hamilton leaned back in his chair, watching Jaden the way a lion watches its prey. This was his kingdom. For 20 years, he had watched young black men stand before him, heads bowed, hands shackled, waiting for the inevitable. Jaden was no different. "A smart boy like you? Yeah, right." His voice dripped with mockery. He turned to the jury, gesturing toward Jaden as if he were nothing more than an exhibit. "You people always think you can outsmart the system." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Lisa Cole sat in the first row, fingers clenched so tightly in her lap they turned white. She didn't speak, didn't move. But in her eyes a storm was brewing. Jaden didn't flinch. Not this time. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man in a navy suit, rose from his seat, adjusting his tie with deliberate precision. "Your Honor," he began, turning toward the jury, "the evidence against Mr. Cole is overwhelming." A large screen flickered to life behind him. The image was grainy, but the message was clear. A terminal full of code, an unauthorized login into the Georgia State Judicial Database. This, the prosecutor continued, is a screenshot captured from the defendant's own laptop, showing him illegally accessing restricted court files. He let the words hang in the air, letting the weight of the accusation settle. Then another image appeared, a pixelated timestamp, security logs, digital breadcrumbs leading directly to Jaden. We have forensic experts confirming that Jaden Cole infiltrated a government database, an action that constitutes a serious federal offense. And yet, the defense would have you believe he was simply looking around. Is that what we're calling hacking these days? A low murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hamilton smirked, shaking his head. What a shame, he mused, his voice laced with fake disappointment. A boy like you could have done something productive with your life. Instead, here we are. The moment stretched, and then Jaden moved. It was subtle, not a shift of weight, not a fidget of nervous hands. He straightened, raised his chin, met Hamilton's gaze head-on. For the first time, the judge's smirk faltered. A journalist lowered his pen. The prosecutor's fingers twitched at his side, and then Jaden spoke. Your Honor, his voice was steady, calm, but sharp as a blade. I'd like to correct the mistake in your ruling, before you send an innocent man to prison. The courtroom fell silent. Hamilton's fingers tightened over the bench. A second passed, then another. Someone coughed. A juror shifted in their seat. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted. They had underestimated him. And now, they were about to regret it. Lisa Cole had spent her entire life fighting for her son. She had fought to keep food on the table, fought against the school officials who thought Jaden was difficult, fought against the neighbors who whispered behind their backs, and now she was fighting again. She didn't wait for permission, didn't care about decorum. She stood, her chair scraping loudly against the polished floor, her voice raw with desperation. This is wrong. The words rang through the silent courtroom. My son is not a criminal. He was trying to do the right thing. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others refused to look at her. Judge Hamilton didn't even blink. He turned to her with the kind of practiced patience reserved for a child throwing a tantrum. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he lifted his hand, a silent command for order. Mrs. Cole, he said, his voice calm, cool. You are not an attorney. You do not have the floor. Lisa's mouth opened again, but a bailiff took a step toward her. A warning. Her breath hitched. This was their game, their rules. She could scream all she wanted. No one would listen. And then, it's okay, Mom. The words were quiet, steady. Jaden had barely moved. He was still seated, still handcuffed, but his voice carried through the room with a weight that made everything else fade. Lisa turned to him, searching his face. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw something new in his eyes. He wasn't scared. Jaden reached into his bag, his movements slow, deliberate. The air in the courtroom seemed to shift. For weeks, they had painted him as a reckless hacker, a kid who had broken into government systems for fun. But now, they were about to see who he really was. He set his laptop on the table, flipping it open with quiet precision. The glow of the screen illuminated his face. Your Honor, he said, his voice even, controlled. I'd like to present evidence that will prove not only my innocence, but also the real crime that took place. A flicker of something, curiosity, maybe doubt, crossed Hamilton's face. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping anxiously against the desk. For the first time, the confidence in the room wasn't with them. Hamilton hesitated. He could have dismissed it, shut Jaden down. But the entire courtroom was watching now. And so, with reluctant authority, he waved his hand. Proceed. Jaden plugged his laptop into the court's display system. The screen behind him flickered to life. The first video appeared, the same grainy security footage that had been used to convict Marcus Carter. This is the prosecution's key evidence in the Carter case, Jaden said, his tone level, almost clinical. He pressed play. The courtroom watched as a man in a black hoodie entered the Wells Fargo bank, duffel bag in hand, timestamp reading 9:42 a.m. The prosecutor smirked, arms folded. We've seen this already, he said. Jaden didn't look at him. Yes, he said. But what you haven't seen, what no one bothered to check, is this. A second video appeared on the screen. Identical footage, same scene, Same man, same movements, but a different timestamp. 9:47 a.m. A murmur spread through the room. The prosecutor's smirk vanished. Judge Hamilton's fingers drummed against his bench. His eyes darkened. Jaden's fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up lines of code. Green numbers filled the screen, seemingly meaningless to most in the room, but to those who understood, it was damning. The original metadata embedded in the file proves the timestamp was altered, Jaden explained. He highlighted a string of numbers, pointing to a specific entry. Every digital file has an edit log. The person who falsified this evidence didn't erase their trail completely. A final keystroke. The code disappeared, and in its place, a name. Assistant District Attorney Mitchell Graves. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, the heavy scrape of a chair as a juror leaned forward. Lisa let out a choked breath, her hand covering her mouth. The prosecutor, who had just moments ago been so certain, was frozen in place. Jaden turned, his eyes locking onto him. "You knew," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "Didn't you?" The silence was deafening. Judge Hamilton's grip on his gavel tightened. For the first time since this trial began, he had lost control. And Jaden Cole? He was about to turn this entire case upside down. The courtroom stood still. The gavel in Judge Hamilton's hand hovered in midair, frozen as if even he wasn't sure what to do next. The gallery, once restless with murmurs and quiet chuckles at Jaden's expense, was now deathly silent. No scribbling from the journalists, no whispers from the jury, not even the faint hum of the courtroom's fluorescent lights. Only silence. The kind that wasn't empty, but heavy, suffocating, unyielding. The prosecutor, Mitchell Graves, sat rigid in his chair. His face had gone pale. Just minutes ago, he had stood with the confidence of a man who had already won, mocking Jaden, parading his so-called evidence, treating this trial as if it were just another open and shut case. Now his hands clenched at his sides, knuckles white. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. This wasn't supposed to happen. Judge Hamilton opened his mouth, then closed it. The gavel, still gripped in his fingers, remained raised but never fell. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He had seen countless black boys stand in this very spot, some frightened, some resigned, some defiant, but all powerless in the end. Jaden should have been just like them. He was supposed to bow his head, accept his fate, crumble under the weight of the system that had already decided his guilt. But instead, he had turned the entire trial against them. And now Hamilton had no idea what to do next. Jaden watched them. Watched the prosecutor's chest rise and fall too quickly, his panic barely contained. Watched Hamilton gripping his bench like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Watched the jury, the reporters, the spectators, all waiting, watching, processing what had just happened. Then, he spoke. His voice was cold, measured, unshaken. "You wanted to mock me." He let the words hang in the air, let them settle like the dust after an earthquake. Then he leaned forward just slightly, not in submission, but in control. "Now, tell me, what do you have to say for yourself?" A beat of silence, and then chaos. The gavel never fell. The courtroom was still in chaos. Reporters whispering, the jury shifting uncomfortably, the prosecutor struggling to form words. But before anyone could regain control, the doors burst open. Two men in dark suits stormed in, moving with the practiced efficiency of trained federal agents. The murmurs in the room turned into stunned silence as they strode straight to the front. The taller one, a man with a hard jawline and government-issued authority in his stance, pulled out a badge. "Jaden Cole," he announced, his voice sharp, cutting through the confusion like a blade. "You are under arrest for unauthorized access to federal databases and national security violations." The weight of the words slammed through the room like a physical force. Lisa gasped, her fingers gripping the rail in front of her like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Jaden barely had time to process what was happening. Judge Hamilton's expression shifted from shock to something unreadable. The prosecutor exhaled, almost in relief, as if the case had just been conveniently taken out of his hands. This wasn't about Marcus Carter anymore. This was about burying Jaden. One of the agents reached for his handcuffs. And that's when the gunfire erupted. It was fast. Too fast. A single sharp crack shattered the air, and for a split second, no one moved. Then, screaming. Panic exploded through the courtroom as people dove for cover. A bullet slammed into the wooden bench inches from Jaden, splintering it into jagged shards. The agents reacted immediately, drawing their weapons and scanning the gallery. But the shooter wasn't in the gallery. Jaden's pulse hammered. His mind, trained to recognize patterns, registered the trajectory in an instant. The shot hadn't come from inside the room. It had come from above. His eyes darted toward the upper levels, the balcony where journalists had been stationed. Amid the chaos, a lone figure stood, partially hidden in the shadows. Black tactical gear, steady hands, a rifle barrel glinting under the courtroom lights. And he wasn't aiming for the agents. He was aiming for Jaden. The second shot fired, Jaden moved. The second shot ripped through the air, striking the wooden panel just inches from where Jaden had been standing a moment before. Then, chaos, screams, chairs scraping against the floor, people scrambling for cover, the jury ducking behind the box, reporters fumbling for their phones while some bolted for the exits. Lisa screamed Jaden's name, but the noise swallowed her voice. The agents who had come to arrest him pivoted instantly, their guns drawn toward the balcony. But the shooter? Gone. Jaden's instincts kicked in. He couldn't just stand there. Someone wanted him dead. And whoever they were, they had planned this. A firm hand grabbed his arm, yanking him down just as another shot cracked through the air. For a second, Jaden thought it was one of the agents, maybe arresting him on the spot. But then he looked up. Agent Carter. The man wasn't like the others. His grip was tight but controlled, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes that Jaden hadn't seen from the other agents. Not suspicion, not hostility. Intent. "Come on, kid," Carter muttered, pulling him low behind the defense table. "You want to live? Move." Jaden didn't hesitate. Another shot rang out, and Carter shoved him forward, guiding him toward the side door of the courtroom. The kind normally reserved for judges and staff. No one stopped them. Not the panicked bailiffs, not Judge Hamilton, not even the prosecutor, who was still frozen in place, his mouth slightly open, as if his mind was struggling to catch up to what was happening. They slipped through the door and into the unknown. The second the door slammed shut behind them, Carter pressed Jaden against the wall, keeping them both in the shadows of the dimly lit hallway. For a moment, neither spoke. Jaden's breath was coming too fast. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his skull. Then he met Carter's gaze. "Who sent you?" he asked. Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Jaden like he was trying to figure something out. Then quietly, almost too quietly, he said, "You don't get it, do you?" Jaden frowned. "Get what?" Carter leaned in. His next words sent a chill down Jaden's spine. "They don't want to put you in prison, kid. They want you gone." Jaden felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just about the court case. This was bigger. And now, he was running for his life. The courthouse was already a war zone. Jaden had barely processed the gunfire, the panic, the federal agents when Carter shoved him toward the exit. His body moved before his mind caught up. Move. Now. Lisa's breathing was ragged beside him, but she didn't hesitate either. They bolted down the dimly lit stairwell, the echo of their footsteps swallowed by the distant chaos behind them. Jaden wasn't sure if they were running from the shooter, the agents, or something much worse. Maybe all three. Carter led them out a side exit, shoving open the heavy metal door that dumped them into a narrow alleyway behind the courthouse. The second they stepped outside, Jaden's breath caught. Black SUVs, unmarked, engines running, not police, not the FBI. Something worse. One of the men standing by a vehicle spoke into an earpiece. His head snapped toward them. The moment their eyes met, Jaden knew. They weren't here to arrest him. They were here to erase him. "Go," Carter hissed, gripping Jaden's arm. "Don't stop." They ran. Gunfire erupted behind them, shattering the glass of a nearby car window. Lisa let out a startled gasp, but she kept moving. Jaden wasn't built for this. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but adrenaline kept him going. He was a hacker, not a fugitive. But right now, he had to be both. As they sprinted through the streets, Jaden's mind was already racing ahead of his body. If someone wanted him dead, they wouldn't just chase him in the streets. They'd come for his evidence. "I need a computer," Jaden gasped, his brain already spinning through worst-case scenarios. "Now." Carter gave him a sharp look. "You planning to send a distress email?" "No," Jaden shot back. "I'm planning to make sure we're not running for nothing." Lisa was pale, breathing hard, but she didn't ask questions. She knew her son. They reached a rundown electronics store just off the main street. Carter hesitated. Breaking in meant leaving a trail. But the second Jaden spotted the security camera out front, he knew they weren't safe anyway. They had less than 10 minutes before their pursuers pinpointed their location. Jaden grabbed a cheap, off-the-shelf laptop, powered it on, and within seconds was inside a secure network. His fingers flying over the keyboard, he accessed his off-site storage, searching for the files he had pulled from the courthouse. The screen blinked. Access denied. Jaden's stomach dropped. Then a new message flashed across the screen. Connection terminated. Someone was deleting his files in real time. Jaden's chest tightened. He wasn't just running from an assassin. He was in the middle of a cyber war. Whoever was on the other side was good. No, they were better than good. The security measures Jaden had set up should have made it impossible for someone to tamper with his files without tripping an alarm first. But this hacker? They had gotten in undetected. Lines of code streamed down his screen, rewriting, encrypting, erasing. His evidence, the truth that could clear his name, that could expose the corruption behind Marcus Carter's case, was being wiped clean, piece by piece. Jaden's fingers moved faster. He fought back, manually rerouting his storage backups, creating firewalls, sending false packets to slow the intruder down. But it was like fighting a ghost. Whoever was on the other end anticipated every move he made. Every time he blocked access, they found a new way in. Every time he tried to copy a file to another location, they deleted it before he could finish. Jaden clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a random attack. This was personal. And then, a final message flashed on his screen. You can't win. Walk away. Jaden stared at the words. His hands hovered over the keyboard. And for the first time since this all began, he felt powerless. His files were gone. His proof was gone. And if he lost this battle, he lost everything. Lisa placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him before he could spiral. Carter glanced at the screen, then at Jaden. There was something in his eyes. Something Jaden wasn't sure how to read. But Carter didn't give him time to ask. We need to move, he said, his voice low. Now. And just like that, Jaden Cole was running again. 1 week later, the truth could no longer be buried. For days, Jaden Cole's name had dominated every major news outlet. His face appeared on television screens, in newspapers, across social media feeds. The world had finally caught up with what he had uncovered, and now there was no stopping the fallout. Judge Richard Hamilton, once untouchable, had been officially removed from the bench in disgrace. His long history of biased rulings and unethical conduct had come to light, and no amount of power or connections could save him now. Prosecutor Mitchell Graves, the man who had fabricated evidence to put Marcus Carter behind bars, had been led away in handcuffs, his career and reputation destroyed. The system that had so confidently silenced innocent men had finally been exposed for what it was. But the greatest victory of all came on a rainy Tuesday morning, when Marcus Carter stepped out of Fulton County Correctional Facility, a free man. Jaden stood in the crowd with his mother, watching as Marcus embraced his wife, his son, his life that had been stolen from him. The cameras flashed, microphones were shoved into his face, reporters shouted questions, eager to capture this moment of justice. But Marcus ignored them all. He turned to Jaden instead. For a long moment, he just looked at him. Then, with a quiet, almost broken voice, he said, "Thank you." Jaden didn't know what to say. He had spent weeks fighting for this, risking everything, and yet standing there in front of the man whose freedom had been stolen, he felt like anything he could say would be too small, too insignificant. So he just nodded. For the first time in weeks, he let himself breathe. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. They called him a hero. Some praised him, some called him reckless, and some hated him. But no matter what side people took, one thing was certain. Jaden Cole had become something bigger than just a kid with a laptop. He was a symbol now, proof that the system could be beaten. And for some people, that made him dangerous. It was past midnight when the phone rang. A disposable burner, no caller ID. In a dimly lit room, a man in a dark suit lifted it to his ear. A voice spoke, cold and calculated. "That kid thinks he's won." There was a pause, a slow inhale. "He has no idea what's coming." The line went dead. Jaden stood by his bedroom window, staring out into the night. For the first time in weeks, there were no police chasing him. No guns, no sirens, no frantic lines of code flashing across a screen in a desperate attempt to save himself. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling. Something was coming. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit the like button to show your support, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to stay with us for more powerful stories that matter. Your support isn't just a click, it's what keeps us going, creating content that sparks conversations, challenges perspectives, and shines a light on the truth. Together, we can make sure voices like Jaden's are heard. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.